Our first roundtable discussion of the day. My name is Melissa Carney. I'm the director of the Hamilton Project, and I'll be moderating this first discussion. As was emphasized by both Secretary Rubin and Governor Brown, the challenge of water in the West is a long-standing challenge, and it demands innovative, lasting solutions. The set of potential solutions we'll be talking about in this first discussion focus on using market mechanisms. So in many contexts and with many goods and resources, we rely on market forces to allocate scarce resources to its highest value. And there's the thought that maybe we could do more in the water area to capitalize on these forces. So the discussion will be based around a set of proposals that are being put forth in a new Hamilton Project Woods Institute paper written by Robert Glennon of the University of Arizona and his co-authors, Gary Leibkap and Peter Culp. And they're going to argue for 5 specific reforms, that take advantage of the market forces in order to allocate water and address the water crisis. We're joined by an all-star cast of experts with a wide variety of perspectives on the issue. Their full bios are in your program, so I won't go through them, but just to remind everyone, we have Tom Eisman from the Department of the Interior, so we'll have the federal perspective. We have Bill Phillimore from Paramount Farming Companies, so we have the farming perspective. We have Jim Lockhead from Denver Water Utility, the largest water utility in the state of Colorado. He was also named Water Leader of the Year in Colorado. And we have Ellen Hannock, who's a recognized expert and scholar on these topics. So before we launch into the panel discussion, I invite Robert to the panel, who will give us an overview of the main ideas of the proposals.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'd like to thank both the Hamilton Project and the Woods Institute for inviting me and Peter and Gary, who are in the second row here, to prepare this paper. It was great to hear the governor's comments. There's a lot of exciting things happening in California. It's a long paper for those of you who've taken a look at it, and they have given me 5 to 7 minutes to set it forth. And so I'm going to go across at the treetop level. We'll get down into the weeds a little bit later on. But first, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time talking about the crisis. The governor made it plain. There's a real problem. California is really at the epicenter. But that said, there are just a few items that I'd like to put forward. One is this photograph of Lake Mead and the Colorado River speaks volumes. We're in the middle of a 14-year drought in the Colorado River, and we don't know whether that's the 14th year of a 14-year drought or the 14th year of a 50-year drought. And it is a challenging time. There are predictions of shortages for the states of Nevada and Arizona within 2 years. The city of Las Vegas is spending $1 billion to build a third intake pipe because the first 2 are about to be pathetically above the level of the lake, totally denying water supply for 2 million people. The future of the Colorado River is one where we're going to see increasing economic growth, increasing population growth. It is a classic problem of supply and demand. California, I don't need to spend much time on that, but 500,000 acres of fallowed land in 2014, some of the most valuable, the most productive ag lands on earth. It is a very sad sight to fly in, as I did a couple of weeks ago to Fresno, and see just the kind of consequences of this drought. Dead and dying trees and orchards, homeowners, as the governor said, thousands of homeowners whose wells have dried up. Texas, finally, their drought began in 2011. They've already suffered more than $25 billion in losses. It's a very, very tough time. A little town in Texas, Plainview, had a meat packing plant operated by Cargill. It closed. 2,200 people lost their job. The whole population of the town was only 23,000. This town's in ruin. So we have a crisis, and the crisis asks for serious thinking and a fresh response. This is a photograph of the High Sierra. If this photograph were taken a year ago today on October 20th, there would not be a problem. But this photograph was taken in February of 2014. You should not see bare ground in the High Sierra in the middle of the winter. Now, is this simply a product of the ongoing drought, temporary fluctuations in snowpack and precipitation levels? Is it something to do with climate change? Or maybe is it both? It is a scary time. When we look at our water systems, what we see is a system that was set up on the assumption that the past would be a reliable guide to the future. There's a new normal that no longer prevails. And yet there's little resiliency in our water systems. Each person or each group hanging on to their little piece of the pie. We need to build resiliency into the system. And the demands for water are of an extraordinarily diverse sort. The knowledge economy, as it was put. This is a Google server farm. You don't think, I think, even in Silicon Valley, about the point that we heard from Cheryl about Facebook needing water. But Facebook, Google, Intel, Cisco, they all need a lot of water to operate. They need energy, and it takes a lot of water to produce the energy, and then they need water to cool these amazing plants. People think of the cloud. Well, there's no such thing as the cloud. There are things like this, data centers. There are now tens of thousands of these data centers, some of them generating as much energy as a decent-sized city. This is a new demand. And we have an incredible national need to make sure that companies like Facebook and Intel and Cisco and Google get all the water they want so that their fabrication facilities are located here, so that these great jobs will be available to our fellow citizens. If you think about water, you realize that basically every company needs water. Every company needs water. It's not just the food people, it's not just the ag interests. The National Hockey League, those teams every year in their stadiums use more than 300 million gallons of water for some hockey rink. Deloitte did a study of the Global 500 last year of a tremendous response. 70% of them said that they currently had a supply problem either in their direct operations or in their supply chain. This is about the future of the American economy. We may fret about running out of oil, but water lubricates the American economy just as oil does. So what are we going to do about it? The governor outlined some options. Business as usual, more dams, more wells, more diversions. I'd like to suggest that's not very practical, and I'll move on. We can revisit that later if you want. I think of the problem as needing a portfolio or a menu approach. And in our paper, what we've tried to do is do exactly that, to outline it this way. Conservation's a big deal. Reuse is a big deal. Desal will also be part of the menu going forward. But those things, either singly or collectively, will not get the job done. We need to go further. Now, what can we do? Price signals to encourage conservation, absolutely. And you'll hear more about that in the next panel. But we also have to recognize that what we have in terms of water is a giant milkshake glass. And what we see is everyone who is using water has put a straw into the glass. But there are more and more straws going into the glass. It's a classic tragedy of the commons problem. We need to break the relentless cycle of overuse. And what Peter and Gary and I set forward in our paper is using market forces to encourage the reallocation from lower value to higher value uses. So there are 5 steps that we suggest we should proceed now. First, we need to reform water law. Water law is arcane, complicated, but at bottom it's this: use it or lose it. That's the rule. Use it or lose it. And the consequence of that is a very peculiar concept of waste. In Western water law, to waste water is not to use the water. To conserve water exposes the water rights holder to loss of the water right. There are no incentives to do what we think needs to be done, the 20% that the governor mentioned. That there would be farmers who just can't do that because they lose their water rights. So our first point, and it's a pretty roll up your sleeves and get into the nuances of water law, is that we need to remove these disincentives. We need to create incentives for people to use less water, not penalizing them if they should use less water. Second thing we need to do is to create market mechanisms to facilitate water trading. We're thinking about water banks, water exchanges. Right now, almost all transfers of water, water trades, are one-off. They're complicated, they take a long time, they're hideously expensive. Economists would talk about transaction costs, and boy, are the transaction costs immense in doing a trade for water. We need to reduce those transaction costs. And so banks and exchanges would do exactly that. Banks and exchanges would possibly serve as brokers, as clearinghouses. They provide trading platforms. They would facilitate the transfer between willing buyers and willing sellers. Next thing we need to do, number 3, is to use risk mitigation strategies to enhance the reliability of supply. We would like to take a page from the investment banking community, from hedge fund business, from commodities markets, from insurance companies, and look at how they hedge risk. We need to build more resiliency into water supply, ag supplies, municipal supplies, industrial supplies. We need resiliency and risk mitigation strategies, futures contracts, dry year options, offer ways to learn from what other parts of the economy have done and build those into the world of water. That's one way to develop increased resilience. Fourth, protecting groundwater. Back to the milkshake glass. Right now, as we sit here, despite this very, very important piece of legislation, the Sustainability Groundwater Management Act of a few months ago, the situation remains that anyone who wants in almost any part of the state can drill a new well and start pumping away with impunity. And that's why all of these homes around the state are having their domestic wells go dry. We need to do better. It's a classic tragedy of the commons. And the final suggestion we have is to continue and expand the federal role, principally the role of the Bureau of Reclamation. I'm very pleased to see what reclamation has been doing over the last couple of decades. When you think about reclamation, most of us, I think about Mark Reisner's classic Cadillac Desert, and we think about Floyd Dominy. Well, it's not your father's bureau these days. It's a completely different world at reclamation. And they have shown enormous leadership in facilitating interstate cooperation and in really giving accurate information for all to digest. They have done some marvelous reports, and we need more of that. We need that kind of leadership. For example, we need the Bureau of Reclamation to insist on water meters on people who get water from their project. Right now, in many parts of the state of California has no idea how much water people are using, even groundwater, and especially groundwater. People just pump, and the state doesn't know how much water is involved. Really, you can't manage what you don't measure. We need to do better. Pilot project, I'll offer 2 that the Bureau could push. 1, right now, we have in Southern California and Southern Arizona, farmers growing alfalfa in the middle of the summer when it's 115 degrees out. There are interesting opportunities for suspending irrigation of alfalfa during the summer. And we need to create opportunities for farmers who do that to financially benefit from doing that. You can't just simply say, we think it would be a good idea for you not to. It's their water right. We need to encourage them to do that. And the Bureau can play a tremendous role. Same with drip irrigation. There are opportunities to use drip that now are not there. So that's the 5th. And finally, I'd just like to make a comment about what does this do, this marketing do to farmers, to the farm community, and to the food supply. People are fearful, and they should be. But this bullet on the last slide suggests why water trading need not harm rural communities. For one thing, the M&I sector certainly doesn't, the municipal and industrial sector certainly doesn't need to double its supply. A modest increase, our point is, in irrigation efficiency would solve the problem. Full stop. A modest increase in irrigation efficiency. Currently, about 50% of lands that are irrigated with flood irrigation. It's an incredibly expensive, incredibly inefficient form of irrigation, but it's very expensive to modernize. Our solution is straightforward. It's a demand offset system. If someone wants to put a new straw into the glass, they need to persuade someone else to take her straw out of the glass. It's not no growth, but it's a system that asks growth to pay its own way. And in that way, water trading can be a win-win. It provides farmers with the capital to modernize their infrastructure. It allows farmers to grow the same product with less water. It allows cities and industry to get the water that's conserved. And finally, the costs are borne by those who want the farmers to use less. And that's how it should be. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm going to start this off with a question to Ellen. Ellen's written extensively and studied very thoughtfully the use of markets in California. So from that perspective, how do you respond to the proposals put forth in this paper, and what can we learn from the California experience with market solutions?
Thanks. And thank you to Robert and your co-authors for a really interesting paper. I recommend plowing all the way through the 40 pages because there's a lot of rich stuff there. I have a short amount of time, so I'm going to just highlight a few things. One of them is thinking about California as an example. I think a lot of the recommendations that they put forth could be very useful applying them here, but also in some ways California is at the forefront on some of the things that the authors point out with respect in particular to laws that enable water marketing to happen. And so we've got actually a pretty, it's not by any means a perfect market, but we've got a pretty active market in California. It's about 20-some years old. It really got going during a major drought from the late 80s to the early 90s, where the state got involved, setting up a water bank, the kind of thing that the authors recommend. We had laws in place already that were passed in the early 80s that made it possible to transfer water without it being taken away from you. You could lease your water and it wouldn't be considered that you were no longer using it. Transferring is considered a beneficial use under California law. So over time, what we've seen happen is initially it was really a market for short-term temporary transfers, especially for drought relief. And over time, it's become also a market where cities are buying water to support their long-term needs. Even some farmers who are growing tree crops are getting into long-term deals so that they have more reliability with these transactions. Mostly the water is being sold by farmers, sold or leased by farmers, with either with extra water in storage or that are able to lower some of their own production. Now, thinking about that, the market now is about maybe 5% of total human water use. So, there's room for it to get bigger, and I think a lot of the recommendations that the authors propose could help with that. I'd like to highlight two things that it's important to think about. One of them with respect to reforming laws and thinking about, are there ways of providing incentives for people to save water and sell it or lease it? I think there are, but it's important not to oversimplify that. And the governor said, water's complex. It really is in this case. And there's a tendency to assume that everything that you save by adopting more efficient irrigation technology is water that you can make available to sell on the market. And it sounds good, and it kind of makes sense at a top level thinking about it. In fact, that's not true, because most of the water that's wasted when you're doing flood irrigation is actually being used by somebody else already. It's going back into the river and being used by a downstream user or city, farmer, or the environment, or it's going into the groundwater basin and it's available for reuse later. So one of the legal reforms that they recommend is adopting some transparent rules so that people know how much consumptive use can be transferred. That's the sort of technical term for the amount that you're actually consuming that's not available for others. California technically has that law. We don't always apply it well. I think it is an important law to get out there and to make transparent so people know how much is available with different crops. The second thing that I'd just highlight briefly is the idea I like very much of mitigating and thinking about reliability. I think that's recommendation maybe number 3. One way to do that is thinking about how the market can help to support the environment. And in California, the market, actually about a third of the trades in many years has been water for in-stream flows and for wildlife habitat. This has mostly been short-term transfers with taxpayer dollars, and that money is mostly mostly gone now. There's very little of that money left. So if we're thinking forward to, can we use a market to help bring water into the environment, we really have to find new funding sources for that. Australia, which is often considered a model for marketing, used $3.5 billion to buy back water from farmers in order to have it available for the market, and that's working pretty well. People were grumpy about it initially, but it's actually working pretty well. I think California and other Western states should really explore that, and my bid, if Prop 1 does pass, this new water bond, is to think about using some of those funds to purchase water rights for the environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving from the state to the federal. Tom, so one of the pillars of the author's proposals is increased or continued and expanded leadership from the federal government. So from your perspective at the Department of the Interior, how do you view the federal role in solving or addressing the water challenges?
Sure. Well, I'm coming at this from the perspective of the Bureau of Reclamation. We're known for owning and operating water supply projects across 17 western states. We provide water to 30 million people and 1 in 5 irrigated farmers. And, I think it's clear that we face some challenges with respect to water supply allocation, and markets can play an interesting role in resolving some of these issues. But it is a complex issue for the Bureau of Reclamation. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and the drawbacks that we see and where we think there's an opportunity for more federal leadership, if not a more active role, which I know might make some people concerned. So some of the benefits and the drawbacks, as we said, there are tensions around water supply allocation across the West. One of the things that we like about water markets is that they allow local solutions. They empower water users. You want to see transactions between willing buyers and willing sellers to resolve these questions about water supply allocation rather than decisions from the federal government. So there are definitely positives about the benefits that we can see from water markets and water transfers. That said, we face a clear tension with some of our agricultural water users. They're partners in our water supply projects. We hear concerns about what do transfers do to the agricultural community, the local economy, the ability to grow food for our society. And that's definitely very front and center in terms of our work in water supply and how we think about water transfers, and it's something that we need to navigate as we look at some of the recommendations in the report. That said, though, I was really impressed as I prepared for this discussion to see how much we are using water markets across the western states to address these issues. And we use them in a variety of different ways. One is essentially to stretch water supplies or reallocate water supplies, and particularly in times of drought. And you see that here in California with the Central Valley Project, which is a reclamation project. It's also happening in Southern California, where you've got transfers from Imperial Irrigation and the Palo Verde irrigation districts to the cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. And it's happening in other places as well. One of the good examples is the Colorado Big Thompson project in Colorado, where we're seeing more water moving between agriculture and cities on a pretty flexible basis. And there are a lot of benefits to that. And one of the emerging examples that I think is really important is something called a system-wide conservation agreement on the Colorado River, where we're partnering with 4 cities, including Denver Water, to look at how you could implement more market-driven, essentially, conservation activities to improve water supply for the Colorado River system. So there are definitely cases where we're using this to stretch water supplies. One of the other places where reclamation is really active is in terms of using markets to provide environmental benefits. And we have obligations throughout the West to sustain and recover endangered species. And in many projects, we're actually an active participant in the market to acquire water for environmental benefits or for refuges or other environmental purposes. It's really surprising to me, just to name a few projects. The Klamath Project is one. We're doing it actively on the Snake River in Idaho. It's happening in the Middle Rio Grande and Pecos Rivers in New Mexico. So these are places where we're using markets actually ourselves to acquire water for environmental purposes. We use markets for the purposes of Indian water supplies and looking at tribal water settlements. And we've used markets to acquire water for tribes to fulfill settlement obligations. And then the settlements often empower the tribes to use their water supplies. They authorize the use of water supplies in markets. And many of the tribes are actually taking advantage of that to move water and to benefit from the economic value of the water that they have. And finally, we're doing some things to institutionalize how we use markets. We do have some policies that speak to measurement and pricing of water at our projects. They're modest steps, and we implement them as we move forward in some of our agreements with the water users. We also have systematic approaches, for example, through our Water Smart grant program, where we actually award project applicants for including ideas about water banks or water markets as part of their proposals. So I think there's clearly a good track record for reclamation and using water markets. And I wanted to point to a few of the things that we see potentially going forward. One, as Robert mentioned, there's a role in leadership, and really the way that we look at that is empowering local leadership. And we need to work with the local water users and empower them to make some of these decisions, some of these decentralized decisions for how to take advantage of markets. But that said, there are some innovations that we can look at, some of the things that are happening right now. One of the things that we're doing is looking to streamline the process, and we've done that here in California with long-term environmental compliance. Let's see, we're also looking to play a role in regional solutions to water supplies. And so when you look at things that we've done, one of the big innovations that we've done is basin studies and bringing water users together across a basin to think about their water supply challenges and some of the solutions that they might be able to take advantage of. One of the best examples is on the Colorado River. And I think it's really stimulated a conversation about, let's look at the objective data and some of the challenges that we face and think about how we solve these problems. And markets can definitely play a role in that. So finally, I just want to conclude by recognizing there's an important role for markets. We're very interested in this conversation. I think there's a productive role that we can play with our local water user partners. And we really appreciate the convening and the people who've come to the table to discuss these issues today. Thanks.
Tom, can I just ask you one follow-up question? Because it strikes me as I listen to you that what you've described is really sort of this innovative market-based projects.
Right.
And when I think historically about what the federal government did, I think about big infrastructure projects. Do you see the federal government role changing? Or did you just emphasize market because that's what we're talking about? Or is that actually? No, it's
definitely changed. I mean, there was an era when we built these projects and it was important. We have a lot of infrastructure, and really that's the reason now why we need to play a role in thinking about some of these solutions. We have this infrastructure. It puts us at the center of a lot of these questions about water supply allocation. I think water markets are one of the tools that we can use to address that going forward, because we're not in the same place in terms of our appropriations and ability to build new water supply projects like we did historically.
Great, thanks. And I know we're going to talk more about infrastructure and innovation in the second panel, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so let's go to the utilities perspective. It's fascinating that there are already partnerships on the ground between the federal government and Denver Water and other utilities. So in your view and your experience, do we need to rely on markets to get some more water allocated to urban users?
Well, certainly the remarks of Governor Brown, Robert, the issues that the paper raises point out in the words of Sheryl Sandberg that we have a really hard project in front of us. Are we up to it or not? I would argue that in this particular instance, failure is not an option. Literally, the future of the West is at stake in terms of how we manage, use, and develop our water supplies. My little slice of that pie is making sure that a city of 1.5 million people and the fastest growing economy in the Intermountain West has a secure water supply for the next 100 years. And that means not only developing water supplies, but making sure that it is here in a healthy, sustainable environment for that period of time. And so cities face, in the face of a changing climate and in the face of tremendous growth challenges, a real dilemma. We're the beneficiaries of vast infrastructure, but the yield of that infrastructure is at risk from climate change, and our ability to develop additional infrastructure is certainly questionable, if not non-existent. We can make a lot of gains in efficiency. Denver Water has reduced our water use by 20% over the last 10 years. We've spent $100 million and saved a cumulative total of over 100 million acre feet. But that's not the answer. That won't do what we need to do. We can develop reuse and desalination projects, but those are expensive, they're energy consumptive, and in a non-coastal city like Denver, reuse is difficult from a regulatory standpoint, and desalination is obviously not on the table. So that leaves us with agriculture. And under the current system, I think the paper is pretty good about pointing this out. In Colorado, at least, our one option is buy and dry. Going to the market and basically doing a transaction, which means we take water from agriculture on a permanent basis, cities get the water, and the agricultural economy dies. And that's a solution that's not acceptable to anybody. The paper points out the fact that we need more innovation and more flexibility in the system, but we face numerous institutional, political, and legal barriers in our ability to do that. Our environmental regulatory structure is based totally on the preservation of the status quo. If you look at temperature, aquatic ecosystems, habitat, all the regulatory framework that we need to go through in developing, using, and managing water supply, it's all based on the status quo. A status quo which will not exist in 20 or 30 years with the advent of climate change, and as we see ecosystems literally moving north. So the entire ecosystem landscape is moving out from under us, and we have a regulatory framework that's just in place. We face operational constraints from the types of water projects the federal government operates that are fixed. And we have large amounts of water that are locked up in federal reclamation projects that cannot get out because of federal law or federal constraints or the constraints of local irrigation districts. We have a water rights administration system that, again, is premised on the status quo. It's based on use, taking water from the river, using it, and maintaining return flows that literally is measured to the gallon. And every water rights transaction that needs to be undertaken needs to preserve that status quo. And so the risk of putting one's water rights up for grabs in a water change proceeding, the transactional costs associated with a market transaction, the cost associated with that means that we don't have the ability to be flexible in the marketplace. Finally, I just want to emphasize the fact that cities are not interested in growing at the expense of either agriculture or the environment. A healthy agricultural economy is essential to the healthy economy of cities. In fact, most of the agricultural economy in the United States is based in city in terms of food processing. We are not interested in developing water supplies at the expense of the environment. A healthy environment is absolutely essential to our ability to supply clean, sustainable water to our customers in the future. So we need to develop mechanisms to work together. And as the paper points out, I think there's plenty of water in the system to be able to do that if we can find those solutions. And a lot of the argument, at least from a municipal perspective that we face, is based around grass. And it's based on this moral judgment that bluegrass is bad, and somehow cities are evil for encouraging their customers or even developing any kind of bluegrass, and alfalfa is good. Or alfalfa is bad and higher value crops are good. We need to get away from these moral judgments about water use and develop a framework to more holistically manage grass. Grass is 90% of the water use in the Colorado River Basin, whether it's bluegrass, alfalfa grass, or pasture grass. We do a good job as municipal entities of doing demand management around bluegrass. And if we develop the flexible mechanisms and the kind of reforms that are established or proposed in this paper, I think we can have a flexible system of managing grass in the system and do it while maintaining a healthy agricultural economy and providing for the environment in cities.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Bill, Jim was very gracious. He doesn't want to fight with the farmers, but I feel like you're a little bit in the hot seat here because we've heard that water law protects the status quo. Seems like the status quo is pretty good for agriculture, not so much for everyone else.
Well, I have to start off with disagreeing with that. I think that water markets work. And just as a mention, I work for a farming company, and we store water on the surface and underground. We buy water, we sell water. So to some extent, we're in the trenches on this stuff every day. Enough to say that I live in Bakersfield, which is a real sign of being in the trenches, for those of you who know California. But I think it's worth, given what all the other panelists have said, of thinking a little bit about how to improve water markets. And again, I'm going to be parochial like Ellen. My experience is in California. It's not in Denver or Arizona, so I have to speak to that. But how to improve markets. And one of the difficulties that we have in water markets in California is the uncertainty of water rights. Water keeps getting taken away from us for the environment. Every time there's a new regulation, the state board can take water away from us. U.S. Fish and Wildlife can take water away from us. NIMFs can take water away from us. Water disappears with FERC relicensing. And so I think it's very difficult if you look at any traditional market. One of the things that you need for an efficient market is the basic right or the basic ownership of the product. And without that, it makes it very difficult, it makes people very uncertain as to what they should do, especially for a long-term deal. The second thing that we need for water markets is decent rules, and rules that we know how they're going to be applied, and we sort of can at least predict within some level what the answer is going to be. I'm thrilled, and actually I think it's true, that the Bureau of Reclamation has speeded up their processes. I would just say that from my perspective, there's still room for further improvement.
No, you're in the hot seat.
It's very deft.
So I think that is a sort of very important side of it. And I also think that, back to Ellen's point that she made earlier, is that if water is the Australian market on the Murray River, and we looked at that some time ago, seems to work very well, but it's also because when the government wanted water for the environment, they actually paid for it, and they didn't just go and take it. And it all comes back to the uncertainty in markets. If we don't have certainty in markets, the markets are not going to develop well. So I think that was sort of the big thing there. But in the developing markets, at least in California, I see no further role for the government, and I have to disagree fairly strongly with that. I think the government needs to get out of the way. And markets, again, there are rules, there are permissions. Every water deal, every water trade we try and do, we run into 2 or 3 different government agencies. They take time. There is no incentive for them to make a decision. And markets, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating an unfettered free market. But this market is so stultified by regulation that it is not working properly. And so I don't think that we need any greater role of the government in things. I think they need to let the market develop and then react to where it goes wrong, rather than do it the other way around.
But you also emphasized a need for rules. So presumably we need the government to enforce the rules of the market.
Yes, but to have rules that are set and don't change on a daily basis or a weekly basis, or don't depend on which branch of what agency you have to go to that day. And I think that's sort of not uncommon.
Do you want to respond to?
Sure, I'd love to say a couple of things. First, thank you. Peter and Gary and I are very grateful to these four for such amazing and thoughtful comments, and it's been very helpful. Let me pick up on Bill's last point about no role for government, because I think it really flags comments from each of the four about what will this do to what will marketing do to the farming communities and to the food supply. And in our paper, what we think is that there needs to be oversight by the federal government. We believe strongly in markets. Rules matter. You can't have a market without rules. You can't have a market without property rights, something to transfer. I sell you my pen. And that depends on a rule that says, at law, I own the pen and I can transfer the pen. So we need to have a system set up by law that facilitates trade, and that depends on the role of government. Then beyond that, markets can fail. And there were several people who said, what about the impacts of trade? And for that reason, we think that particularly when it comes to not the farmers so much, they're going to make out wonderfully. The farmers are going to be the direct beneficiaries of someone writing a check, paying them to modernize their infrastructure or whatever. But what about the farm workers? What about the businesses who are in the farming community? The John Deere dealer, the pesticide fertilizer suppliers, local businesses of any stripe. When you have transfers, you have impacts from transferring a public resource, which is what water is, a public resource that's subject to some market rules and aspects, but it still is public. So I think we need to prevent the buy up and dry up. To assure the protection long term, we need, over, say, a certain quantity of water, a government regulatory process. Now, I'm not familiar enough, as Bill is, with what you've got going on in California, and it frankly sounds hideous. So, some streamlining of that is in order. But it's also to make sure that the transfers don't harm the environment. Because as Ellen was saying to start, a lot of this water serves is performing ecosystem services in the environment. And if you just willy-nilly start transferring large pockets of water, you need to take into account what is that doing to the downstream environment. So we're very much in favor of rules, but sensible rules to protect the farm community and to protect the environment. Now, it's worth noting that in most of the transfers that have been going on, and Ellen's right, most transfers are farmer to farmer, taking advantage of spot markets. But in some studies that Gary Leibkap and I did, we found that aggregate farm income over 25 years in 12 Western states with 3,200 trades and leases did not go down. Well, how can that be? Well, because farmers are savvy business people. When someone comes in and offers them some money, the farmer can say, no, I like what I'm doing, I'm going to use it all, I've got good product, I enjoy it. Maybe I just like losing money. The old joke about how to make a small fortune in farming is to start with a large one. So maybe that's the answer. Or they say, that land out by the barn, it's all clay soil. We can fallow that, it wasn't very productive anyway. Or they do some adjusting of their crops. They change from one crop to another. Or they use the city or the environmental group's money. I mean, in the paper, we talk about water trusts in Oregon and huge sums of money being put forward by an environmental group to persuade someone to modernize infrastructure, and that's what they do. And then you get to grow the same product with less water. That's the critical part. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we aren't harming farming communities. I think everyone on the stage absolutely gets that. Just one final comment, and that is in response to something that both Tom and Bill talked about with the Colorado Big Thompson project working. But in many areas, and the reason for that is that the water rights are very clear. You get a share of water, and you know what it is, and so it's like your pen. I'm going to sell you the blue pen. But in many irrigation districts in particular, in California and elsewhere, the rights are not quantified for the individual farmer. And the individual farmer is given permission to use a certain quantity of water, and they pay for that by acre foot. But if instead of using 6, they use 4, well, that just means they pay $20 an acre foot less. They don't benefit financially, so they may as well pay the modest amount that the district's charging and continue to use it to grow, for example, alfalfa year-round. So I'm very encouraged by this opening set of remarks. There's nothing I'm particularly troubled by that anyone on the stage said, and instead I think it's, we got some potential here. We really do.
So I'm troubled by one thing you said in your presentation, which is that this all presupposes that we can measure water withdrawn and water used and water rights transferred. How far are we from that reality? I mean, it sounds like we need years to get all of that data before we can even really talk about having well-functioning markets.
Depends.
I don't think that's true at all.
We have the...
I think that, at least in California, I think we have pretty good measurement systems. One of the criticisms I have actually of the paper is that, we've now got groundwater regulation in California. We need it. But, for us to measure water use by wells, by counting the number of wells and putting meters on the wells, rather than by using satellites to pick up consumptive use, seems to me to be sort of 20th century rather than 21st century. And when I'm talking about measuring consumptive use by satellites, the latest Landsat satellite has a component. It's not perfect yet, and they don't fly over often enough, but just think about the cost of regulating wells, putting meters on them, reading those meters, in contrast to an airplane flying up and down the Central Valley maybe twice a week. I mean, we've got to look at some of those things. I think it's all measurable.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Just to say, Idaho's already doing that, and Idaho's using satellite imagery to regulate water rights, groundwater, surface water management. So it's early 21st century. It's not far in the future.
Yeah, no, it's right there. It's not that it's right there now, but I mean, within a year or two.
In Colorado, it's so measured that we're slaves to it. We have to actually, as I mentioned, we have to preserve the status quo to the gallon. And that means that any market transaction is in this rigid framework and there's no flexibility. And you have a system where, and I'm a water lawyer, lawyers and engineers are litigating these issues, and it's a barrier to any kind of flexibility or innovation.
Great. So one other, go ahead, Ellen.
Just, in relation to the groundwater issue, I do think that a key to successful reform in California is going to be letting farmers be able to trade their groundwater. And so, right now the legislation just sets up a framework for basin management authorities at the local level to decide what their sustainability management is going to be, but it's going to have to be getting to some sort of sustainable yield over time, and an important incentive in that process will be allocating in some way the rights to pump and enabling some folks who maybe don't have the great soils to sell that water to somebody who's got the tree crops on great soils or very productive uses.
I would agree with that, but you do have to be careful because of the way that groundwater moves and doesn't move, the different qualities of groundwater within a certain area. And, you know, there are certain things in water that work on a very local basis, certain work a little wider, certain wider still. And I think groundwater trading you're going to find will be pretty localized, depending a little bit how it's connected to surface water. But if it's pure groundwater trading, it's going to have to be very localized.
Interesting. So I have another practical question for how this would work, because Robert, you've referred to selling your blue pen, but it seems to me selling waters is not actually that concrete, right? So when we talk about property rights to water, how in practice, maybe in the state of California or in other places, does this work? Is this withdrawal? Is it consumptive use? Is it for a set amount of time? Does it depend on who else is sharing water from that source?
It can be all of the above, and Jim can speak to this, but for surface water, you get a right to take a certain amount out. There's an assumption that some of that returns to the system. That's called return flow. So you may or may not have your right defined by consumptive use. The problem when you go to transfer it isn't that you don't know how much you can take out. It's everyone else in the system gets to object when you go to transfer it under a rule called the no harm to junior appropriators. Everyone is there. And so what we call for in the paper is let's define water rights by the amount consumed. And it could be by Landsat satellite imagery. It could be, I mean, to flesh out Bill's point, what he's saying is that it's not the gray stuff and the balance of the earth changing. It's that by satellite you can see that's alfalfa or that's some other crop, and you know in that area how much water that crop takes. So let's define water rights, have the state water department agencies define water rights by that consumptive use. Then we don't have to get, every time someone wants to transfer water, into a potential fight that pits hundreds of other people on the same system. Instead, there'd be a presumption if you're growing alfalfa in this area, this is how much water the alfalfa consumes.
But at the same time, we're not sophisticated enough to have a system in place whereby we can have flexible mechanisms. So at this point in time, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for a city to go to a farmer and say, I will pay you to rotate the fallowing of your fields, you know, as you choose, just make sure you provide so much water. Or I will pay you not to irrigate in the heat of the summer. Or I will pay you to switch from a higher consumptive crop to a lower consumptive crop. Or I will pay you to install conservation measures. All of that is basically undoable because of this regime of having to preserve a set return flow pattern back into the river, and because of the Byzantine nature of the transactional costs associated with making that kind of a deal. And so what the paper highlights is it's impossible right now for us to sit across the table and actually make that kind of a deal. And cities are willing to pay third-party impact costs. That should be part of the transaction, but we literally can't get to the table to make that kind of a transaction.
We, I think, can, though, in California, if you're not growing anything on that piece of property. It's much more difficult to make the judgment, say that I'm not going to irrigate my alfalfa during the summer. That's a different option. But if you actually fallow that land, then you can. Mm-hmm. You can do that thing. So again, a little bit of a difference between the states.
And we need to build in the kind of changes that Jim's talking about, especially on the alfalfa in the summer. Alfalfa grown in parts of California during the summer uses 4 times as much water as other cuttings during the year, and it produces alfalfa with a lower quality. It's poor quality alfalfa, and it's even poor quantity. The yields aren't very good. So if we're going to protect the farming communities, for goodness sakes, we have to figure out a way to get the very most wasteful uses out of the system. And that would be growing alfalfa in the middle of the summer. You don't want to fallow the whole field year-round, that there's some high-quality alfalfa being grown, and alfalfa sometimes gets a bad rap as being, oh, that's just for people who eat beef. Well, alfalfa is also supporting dairy, and I dare say almost everyone in this room eats yogurt and whatever, dairy products, so you've got alfalfa coming that way. And it's a direct production. My goodness, you feed Bessie some hay in the morning and you milk her in the afternoon. What could be better for food production than that in a matter of hours? So we need to protect alfalfa growers in those communities, but we need to get them off of growing it under conditions as extreme as in the deserts of Arizona and California in the summer.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Just to say, and these are the kinds of things that are doable, and you know, it's not technical rocket science, or I don't know, maybe rocket science is easy now. But what you have is, you know, partly issues of not having clear regulations at the state level or state and federal working together. But I think also we have this at the local level sometimes. And in California, you have some irrigation districts, for example, that will allow you, if you're a farmer, to fallow, to lease water to yourself in another irrigation district, but not to lease water to somebody else. And you know, that's something that kind of doesn't make sense because it leads to all kinds of crazy land leasing in order to be able to get the water moving around. Those are the kinds of things I think that are potentially can be decided at a state level, basically saying, you know, you gotta make that flexibility.
But it is remarkable the way that people have found to get around those things by leasing land to each other. It's probably like the U.S. tax system. You know, there's so many regulations that, you know, the people who operate in it find ways to get around the regulation in order to get the economic deal done.
But all of those require high-priced lawyers, and then that's okay, Jim. So, but and hydrologists also okay for those of you who are hydrologists. But it's expensive. The transaction costs. They're all each one is. John Leshy once famously quipped that irrigation districts are like snowflakes. Each one is different. When you're trying to set up some general rules, something that a state can do, and you've got all of these sui generis irrigation districts, it's darn difficult.
So I want to ask about a different element or characterization of the problem. So what we've talked a lot about is reallocating water away from, let's say, low-value uses to higher-value uses, or from, you know, farmers who find themselves with excess supply to urban users who don't have enough. But there's a really interesting figure in the paper that shows supply is generally flat in the Colorado River Basin, generally flat, maybe if you squint, a slight downward trend. But it's the demand for water that's rising with no sign of stopping. So we talk about a water scarcity problem, but when I look at that figure, I think, oh, it's not that we have less water, we just have too many people who want it, right? And so, you know, is this really a water problem, or is it, why is everybody living and growing their technology businesses in the driest part of the country? And so it either seems like, well, maybe we have to shift some of that development, or people living here or companies working here have to figure out how to do more with less. Right? That's a little bit different spin than the allocation angle.
Well, the elephant in the room is population growth. We nudged over 300 million in the United States about 4 years ago, and the Census Bureau predicts that we're going to hit 420 million by 2060. 2060. That's in the lifetime of many of you in the room, not some of us.
Ellen.
So demand, you're an economist, I can speak to you in the language of our tribe.
We'll include everyone.
Demand, we usually think of as economists as what people are willing to pay for. And I would say, I think the basin study is great, but that line for demand is not what people are willing to pay for. It's more what people would like to use. And one of my close colleagues, Richard Howitt from UC Davis, likes to say that the problem is not that there's not enough water, there's just not enough cheap water. And so this is where markets, I think, come in, because you really are talking about water becoming more scarce, potentially more expensive. What are people willing to pay? Urban areas are willing to often pay for recycled water and some other high-cost things, but you know, there's also just a lot of really cheap water still in the Colorado River Basin, and some of those uses probably are going to go away.
interesting.
Yeah, I guess speaking as one of those evil cities, Denver serves about 25% of Colorado's population. We use about 2% of the state's water. 90% of the water in the Colorado River Basin is used for alfalfa or pasture grass. So it's not a matter of growth, and in fact, I think what we should be doing is encouraging highly dense, innovative, vibrant cities as centers of culture and commerce and economy, and at the same time, maybe we can preserve a vibrant agricultural economy and rural lifestyle that's so important in the West. So I think what we need to do is to free up that market to allow for us to live within our means. And that's, Tom mentioned the Colorado River System Conservation Agreement, and that's kind of an experiment by Denver Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and the Bureau of Reclamation, where we're saying we want to fund pilot projects that will demonstrate how conserved water can be managed from agriculture to the benefit of the river system and the reservoirs in the Colorado River, which are at dangerously low levels. And it's amazing the reaction that we've gotten. If we get on-the-ground farmers, they're interested as business people in doing a deal. If you talk to local politicians, they will tell you that this is all about these terrible cities that are going to dry up agriculture, and all for the benefit of Las Vegas. So we need to just get over those cultural, regional differences and actually get down to talking about how we can do this and keep everybody's economic interests whole.
Thanks. So we're going to open it up for audience questions. And we have folks going around with microphones. Go ahead.
This may be a dumb question, but we have massive pipelines in this country that run for hundreds of miles transporting oil. Why can't we do it with water?
We could do it with water, and there are some people who would like to do it with water, and there are those people who fear we will do it with water. There's a great billboard that shows the Great Lakes, an actual billboard on the side of the road in Michigan. It shows the Great Lakes, and then it shows California with a straw to one of them, and Nevada with another, and Colorado with a third. And whenever I'm back there, I say, this is a scurrilous attack on this. We don't want all the Great Lakes. We'd be happy with one of the smaller ones. You can do it, but the price of water is very low relative to oil, and water is heavy. It weighs, your Nalgene bottle, a quart weighs 2 pounds. So when you start to talk about an acre foot, you're talking about 1,350 tons of water moving, and it just isn't worth it. To say nothing of, can you imagine the regulatory nightmare of trying to cross 7 states? And the Rocky Mountains, did I forget that? So it can be done, but to be, not quite so jovial about it, I want to make a point about what's been referred to as the demand-supply study that the Bureau of Reclamation did in 2012. They deserve enormous credit on that. What they said is there are ideas all over the place, towing icebergs from the Arctic, different kinds of ways of saving water. We're going to put all of these things together, and we're going to treat equally every one of them. We're not going to have a preferred solution. They examined 140 or 160 solutions. They subjected them to rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and they just let the chips fall. Well, at the end of the day, projects like that didn't make the cut because there were other things that were so much clearly less expensive. And for me, it was, and for Peter, we did a little writing on this, it was really the Bureau of Reclamation announcing that these large water projects that we built in the past, that was an interesting era, and that era is over. It's not going to happen again. You're not going to find large new dams being built and hundreds of miles of canals. You either have the infrastructure in place now or you're not going to be able to do it. You can tweak the ones in place, but you're not going to be doing that. And it was Reclamation that gave a very sober message to the 7 basin states saying, these ideas just don't make economic sense. What does make economic sense? Conservation and reuse. There are a few others, but basically conservation and reuse will get the urban sector a long way down the road.
Great. Do we have one over here? Did you? Okay, great. Can you please announce your name and affiliation before your question.
Thank you. David Beckman with the Pisces Foundation. I thought it was very interesting that Professor Glennon put up a slide that said that basically 9% reduction in ag water use would double water for other users. And then I heard an immediate disagreement with that. I think this is a critical question that underlies most of the conversation this morning on the panel, and I wondered what is the source of that disagreement, if there is one? And maybe each of the panelists could indicate how they view that question. Is that water available with ag efficiency for other users or not? It's an important question.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you followed up on that. Ellen and I had the initial discussion on that. I mean, she thought that maybe there wouldn't be as much available. If it depends. In some areas where you have flood irrigation, that water is going back to a river system. In other areas, there's no river system, but there might be something like the Salton Sea. But regardless of what might be downstream, there's a certain measure that's just gone to evaporation loss. And when you're growing alfalfa in the desert, when it's 115 degrees out, and you're flood irrigating those lands, you're losing a lot of water to the air. That water's gone. That's not available for reuse. So I'm not trying to suggest that we can simply or simplistically say that everything not consumed by the crop is available for transfer. Not at all. A lot of that water is performing, as I said, environmental services. But there is some water that's just gone. And let's quantify that and focus on that. Plenty of water.
Bill?
That's why just a small...
I think actually there's a different point here. And that is that where water is very expensive, as in the southern San Joaquin Valley, there is no flood irrigation, right? I mean, the marketplace is taking care of these issues if it's allowed to function. And the problem where you've got people flood irrigating alfalfa is that, and I'm sorry that I'm doing a bad job for my dairy friends, but I don't really know all the circumstances, but it's usually because there is water that is very cheap that they cannot move elsewhere, and therefore they're using it inefficiently. The market will take care of the problem.
Any more questions?
May I just?
Yes, go ahead,
Yeah.
Ellen.
So I think that the answer, David, is it does depend a lot on where you are. I didn't read Robert's 9% to mean just reducing irrigation, improving irrigation efficiency, but reducing agricultural water use by 9%. And sometimes that can be, sometimes that has to be with reducing crop production. So the suggestion of reducing summertime alfalfa is actually reducing crop production, but alfalfa is one of those great crops that you can let just sit around for a while and without killing it. So that's a good way of being smartly efficient with irrigation.
Great. So we're right on time for our short break before we'll move into our second panel. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah.